right, we're all settled. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the panel on norms, conventions, and constitutional governance, which I am renaming "What the heck is going on here and what should we make of it all?" I'm Ruth Marcus from the Washington Post. I'm the deputy editorial page editor, so if you have an op-ed to write in 800 words, you can send it my way. And I'm also a columnist who is in the middle of speed writing a column on my renamed topic of the panel. I guess I'll go from that direction. You have the longer version of all of our esteemed panelists' bios, so I'm going to do the very short version. At the end here is Dahlia Lithwick, senior editor of Slate and known to everyone for her brilliant and incredibly funny writings on a not always funny topic. Most welcome to the American Constitution Society, not his natural venue, but we're all finding ourselves in weird alignments these days. But welcome to the belly of the beast. Bill Kristol, founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard. Next, Professor Aziz Huq. Am I saying it right? Okay, good. Oh, wow, lucky. Professor at the University of Chicago School of Law. And next, she needs absolutely no introduction, Pam Carlin of Stanford Law School and formerly of the Justice Department. And Neil Siegel, who is going to start off by explaining this all to us, norms and conventions and whatever it is we call them, professor of law and political science at Duke Law School. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for getting up early to listen and think about this weighty topic. So Neil, why don't you start us off by explaining what is it that we talk about or that you talk about when you talk about constitutional norms? And I know you don't always say constitutional norms, so take it from there.
All right, great. Well, thank you, and it's great to be here, and great.
Oh, you know what? I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second.
Sure.
I forgot to do some of my job, so I really apologize.
I finished. So.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was brilliant. Okay, my job includes telling you to turn off your cell phones or put them on silent, also panelists. Telling you that if you would like to tweet, and you might as well because the president was back on Twitter this morning. The ACS Twitter handle is @ACS Law, and the official hashtag is #ACS 2017. If you would like continuing legal education credit, which I hope this merits, please sign in with the staff. And actually, perhaps most important, I actually don't need continuing legal education credit because I have been retired from the practice of law since I passed the bar. I don't know why I took the bar. And finally, we're going to save 30 minutes for questions at the end. So please write them on index cards. They will be collected. Raise your index card to alert folks that you've got a question, and we will duly ask it. And now I will uninterrupt you, Neil. Thank you.
All right. No worries. So I'm going to invoke the authority of my 12-year-old daughter, Sydney. She's only 12, but she's an old and wise soul. I was driving her to school in the wake of the election, and we were listening to an NPR story about the president-elect. I couldn't tell you what the context was, but it involved some questionable behavior by him. And when the story was over, Sydney sighed, and she turned to me and she said, "You know, Dad, we didn't break the glass ceiling, but we sure seem to be breaking a lot of other things." And I think norms, political norms, constitutional norms, what I call constitutional conventions, I think they provide a language, a way of speaking about what many Americans understand in their guts but struggle to articulate. I think because we have a written constitution and federal laws that we tend to place a lot of reliance on, we often view the politics as a realm in which anything goes. We're free to indulge our appetites or exercise our wills to whatever extent the law or the Constitution permits. And then certain things happen, and our guts tell us that's just wrong. You just can't do that. Fine, maybe you have the legal authority, but that's not really the point. Right? Political norms are norms of political behavior, norms of proper governmental conduct that guide and therefore constrain political actors in how they exercise their discretion. Political norms are another word for that are conventions, norms of proper governmental conduct. Constitutional conventions, or constitutional norms as you call it, and I understand your hesitation. When I say constitutional conventions here, you're thinking George Washington, James Madison. When I say constitutional conventions in England and New Zealand, right, they mean what I mean. What I mean is that these political norms or these conventions that are tied to a constitutional purpose, that seek to vindicate some fundamental function or basic purpose of the Constitution. It could be facilitating democratic self-government, like the norms of political participation and the electoral college method of electing the president. People don't have a constitutional right to vote for president, at least that's the conventional view, and yet it would be unthinkable for state legislatures to simply appoint a slate of electors. Right? Electors arguably aren't legally bound to vote in accordance with the popular vote in their states, and yet throughout history, the vast majority of electors haven't felt entitled to do whatever they want. Other constitutional conventions vindicate norms of judicial independence, like, for example, norms against partisan packing of the Supreme Court. Other constitutional conventions seek to vindicate the rule of law. The Take Care Clause of the Constitution charges the president with maintaining the rule of law. And therefore, it is a deep-rooted constitutional convention in our country that the president permits executive officers charged with enforcing the criminal law a broad range of independence and discretion. Regardless of what the legal constraints are, that is a convention that presidents of both parties in previous administrations have long respected. So that's at least some of what political norms and constitutional conventions are and why they matter.
And just to take a random example about the freedom that a prosecutor would normally have to be free of interference by the chief executive.
I'm just brainstorming here.
Yeah, good. That's what hypotheticals are for. Aziz, can you tell us a little bit about the norm, if you will, of other countries and how they think about this question? Because we've talked about New Zealand. We all may be moving there sometime soon. So what's it going to be like?
It's a beautiful place.
What's it going to be like for us?
So after the election, the question that to my mind is how stable and durable is the constitutional order. Part of my background is having been a political analyst in South Asia and having seen constitutional orders degrade and decline in a number of South Asian countries. The question of stability didn't seem obvious to me. But there's a conventional wisdom in the political science literature that once democracies become wealthy enough, once they are above a certain threshold of per capita GDP, they don't decline. This is an argument that was developed about 20 years ago. And a colleague and I went and looked at the data on democratic survival or decline. And what we found was, using a database called Polity, looking over the last century, there have been at least 37 instances in which reasonably well-developed countries have suffered substantial but not complete declines in the quality of their democracy. That is, their democracy is not a stable state phenomena. And this started us thinking about, well, what is it about, or how is it that democracies decline? What are the mechanisms through which the institutions, norms, practices, conventions that make up a stable democracy unravel? And looking over the panoply of examples from Hungary and Poland to Venezuela, Bolivia, Turkey, Russia, what we saw was that there are a number of predictable mechanisms through which democracies falter and become substantially less vital. And comparing those mechanisms that we see in other jurisdictions playing out to the US Constitution, I think one doesn't walk away with confidence that the Constitution itself imposes serious impediments to democratic decline. So what we saw was basically 5 different mechanisms, one of which the Constitution really does put a roadblock on, preventing democratic decline, but 4 of which the Constitution really has very little to say about. And it's the absence of constitutional constraint that makes the norms and conventions that Neil was talking about important. So just to give you a couple of examples, one of the important ways in which democracies falter is through formal constitutional change. Right? Many rulers come into office and seek new constitutional conventions which either substantially amend or replace existing constitutional texts. One of the most important changes rendered in that process is the elimination of presidential term limits. It's an obvious formal constraint on the consolidation of autocratic power. Our Constitution, in Article 5, makes it extraordinarily difficult for formal constitutional change to happen. And this has been something that liberals, in particular, have inveighed against. This is not seen as a wise decision on the part of the framers. Now, I know it might be that there are legitimate grounds for criticism in other domains, but at least with respect to democratic backsliding, our extraordinarily, exceptionally rigid constitution, there's no other constitution in the world that's as rigid as ours, may turn out to be a good thing. But on other metrics, our constitution does not perform as well. And this is not terribly surprising. It's an old and durable constitution. It was written based upon comparative and political science insights that were available in the 1780s. The world turns, we learn things, we see forms of both development and retrogression that the framers were not familiar with. And there are a panoply of devices that we see in present day or more recent constitutions that have, in some instances, provided checks on democratic backsliding, but that are absent in our Constitution. And just 2 examples of that is, in many other constitutions, there are formal mechanisms of horizontal accountability. That is, when a person vested with, say, the executive power, either commits malfeasance or criminal acts, the Constitution provides for or creates a body tasked with investigating, insulates that body to a certain degree from political interference, and provides mechanisms that range in severity with respect to sanctions to calibrate responses in line with different kinds of executive wrongdoing. Our Constitution has impeachment, which is a political process and doesn't really have any other alternatives. This is why we rely today upon a special counsel mechanism that is not even embodied in a federal statute. It's embodied, by and large, in a regulation. So I could continue with respect to other kinds of mechanisms, for example, protections of civil servants that are contained in many other constitutions but not our own, that have, in some instances, prevented democratic backsliding, but which we don't have. So when I look at the world of comparative constitutionalism and think about its lessons for our democracy, what I see is that one would be unwise and naive to rely purely upon the formal constitutional rules that are contained in our Constitution without thinking about the panoply of informal understandings, mentalities, and dispositions that have, through the hard work of many public servants, developed over time, through the hard work of many elected politicians, journalists developed over time, but that are inchoate, felt, not verbalized, and that are, under circumstances of, in particular, political and media polarization, extremely vulnerable.
Great. Bill, I think that looking at you summons the famous debate answer or question, who are you and why are you here? And I think that you're here because it's traditional for conservatives, as the name implies, to care about keeping to norms. But perhaps you can elaborate.
Well, first of all, it's good to be here. I mean, I didn't know this was really the belly of the beast. It's not a very, it's not a very terrifying beast. I've got to be honest. I don't want to. Not a particularly horrifying belly either. I don't know how that metaphor goes. Where does the belly of the beast come from? Actually, that would be, I guess, Jonah. Maybe
it might be biblical.
Jonah and the whale.
And it's the legal beast
and
anyway.
The
legal beast
well, the
is
legal
a different
beast is
kind
horrifying,
of beast.
but the ACS beast less so. No. I would say honestly, and I'm not making a polemical point. I mean, I very much agree with what's been said. I think if one consequence of the current moment leads to a rethinking of let's call them constitutional conventions and constitutional norms on the one hand, as opposed to a somewhat simple-minded belief in the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy, the solution to the problems of popular government is more direct accountability and popular responsiveness to popular will, and if the current crisis leads to a rethinking of the notion that all is progressing wonderfully and wealth solves all of our problems and we don't have to think seriously about the institutions and norms that sustain self-government, that self-government, as the founders said, is an experiment. And the founders, incidentally, were not simple-minded about this. They knew that, A, they knew it was an experiment that could always fail. B, they knew, and they knew from history, that prosperity does not necessarily go with successful freedom, maintenance of liberty and self-government. In fact, they had many instances where it would cut the other way, and those are cited in the Federalist Papers. So that's all good, and I hate to say this, but in a way, this is a conversation that could easily have been taking place at the Federalist Society, or since I don't really, that's not my world, but let's say the world I was educated in, which was a sort of, more conservative strains of political philosophy, let's say Tocqueville and Hayek, as opposed to more what I would regard as a more simple-minded progressivism and egalitarianism of a John Rawls, for example, or many 19th century progressives. So honestly, I think it's a very interesting discussion. It's an important one. I would say that one should think through the implications of this. One implication of being serious about conventions is that you can't change them too quickly or easily, and you can't spend all your time mocking the simple-minded belief in old-fashioned things like the rule of law or the original text of the Constitution or the founders' intent. Because everyone knows, I mean, come on, let's be grown up about it. It was a coup at the time of the founders, and there was no original intent, and of course we're for a living constitution. And maybe all those of courses could be put into parenthesis, and people could hesitate a little bit as they're going about cheerfully debunking all these old-fashioned views, which actually turn out to be rather useful to the maintenance of a free society and a constitutional democracy.
Pam, and I promise that this is not going to be, we're going to get to have everybody's sort of opening thoughts on different aspects of this issue, and then we are going to engage in, as Bill provoked us a little bit, a little more of a, and just everybody's still caffeinating up, so don't get too cozy there. We're going to engage in a little bit of a free-for-all, but Pam, maybe you could talk about what you'd like to talk about, but in any event, bring in a little bit of the kind of historical perspective of norms as they've evolved in America.
Yeah, so I was struck, I came in from the airport yesterday and I got off the bus from Dulles down at L'Enfant Plaza and I walked up to the hotel, and as I was walking past what used to be the old post office building and is now the Trump Hotel, which I had to cross the street, of course. Are
you staying there?
God, no. Never. But as I was walking past it, I noticed there's a statue of Ben Franklin outside of the hotel. And of course, the thing that instantly popped into my mind because I was coming to do this panel is the famous remark that Franklin makes at the end of the Constitutional Convention when he leaves the room and he's out on the street and this woman comes up to him and says, well, what kind of government do we have? And he says,
yours, madam. You keep it.
Well done. Well done,
There's your CLE credit right there.
That's right. That's right.
How could you possibly know that? You're progressives.
And one of the things that's so striking is that we have had a series of constitutional conventions, constitutional norms that I think have gone unquestioned for long periods of our history. I thought I would just point to two constitutional conventions or norms that were broken by democratic presidents and that led to a kind of solidification of the norms. One of them, which has already been alluded to, is the 2 terms for president. Right? For over a century of our history, the idea was we had presidents who came into office, they served 2 terms, and then like Cincinnatus or Washington, they returned to their farm. Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, I think it was a good thing in the short run to have Franklin Roosevelt as the president in 1940 and then again in 1944. But the reaction to that was our constitutional convention of very term-limited presidents had been broken, and we then saw the adoption of the 22nd Amendment. The other one, which I thought about immediately before seeing Franklin as I walked my sorry way through Washington, was as I walked past the Department of Justice, where I had the privilege of working several years ago, I thought about another one, which is our country is a country that does not have a nepotistic executive branch. The idea of having an executive branch is not that the president uses it to take his inexperienced, loopy children and their spouses and put them into office. But of course, you will all remember that the building I was walking past is called the Robert F. Kennedy Building of the Department of Justice. A president who turned out he'd made a good guess, but took his inexperienced younger brother and made him the Attorney General of the United States. And after that, we didn't pass a constitutional amendment, but we did pass a statute that essentially says no nepotism in the executive branch, because the kind of government that we conventionally had was one in which people who had experiences other than birth to the president run the country. I'll just mention one last norm that I think we had all had in our Constitution that has been broken this time around, which is the norm, constitutional norm, was that the person who was elected president was someone who had some experience of public service sometime in his life. It might have been a governor or senator, it might have been a mayor or a representative, it might have been a military officer. This is the first time in our country's history that we have elected a president who, before he became president, had never served in public service for a minute, a second, a nanosecond of his entire life, and we are reaping the whirlwind of that.
Period.
Period. Period.
Okay, so an excellent segue. So Dahlia, about that whirlwind, bring us to the here and now, and as you listen to this very high-minded and highfalutin discussion, how would you translate that into kind of a story of what we're experiencing?
Well, so first of all, thank you. It's always a joy to be in the belly of the beast. I like the beast better when it's drinking on the night before, but it's okay now. I want to tag on to one thing that Pam says that I think is so profound, and it's the thing, it seems to me, that undergirds this conversation about the dissolution of norms. It's not just that now we've elected somebody who hasn't had 1 second of service. It's that that argument is being deployed, effective yesterday, to say, and that's why it's okay that he fired the supposedly, independent head of the FBI, because he just didn't know. He just doesn't know. And I just want to say, to the extent that there's something pernicious going on, it's not just norms being violated, it's that weaponizing the violation of the norms to say, and so the norm clearly didn't matter, or it's irrelevant, or those days are over, is really the thing to watch for, it seems to me. So that once you start saying, well, you know, he didn't know there's a norm that says you don't fire people because they're investigating your friend. You know, so nothing going on here. I mean, maybe if the president was 12, like Neil's daughter.
No. You are not going to demean the dignity of my 12-year-old daughter.
We have a constitutional norm that you have to be 35 to be president.
That's not a constitutional norm. That's a constitutional rule.
Right, that's right. We've got some text on that.
Right. But, okay, so
maybe if the president was 36, like his son-in-law.
Let us stipulate that Neil's daughter would be an outstanding president at this moment.
There goes the glass
she knows
ceiling.
she wouldn't be. She's training to be an astrophysicist.
But I think, okay, so now I've fundamentally derailed everything. But
that was your assigned panel role.
Just bring the chaos. I do want to say something responsive to what Ruth asked. And I think I want to say this. I think that there is, and it goes back to what Neil says about this being a really sort of clunky old constitutional democracy, you know, one that's been around for a long time. I think that in a way the civic religion in this country around constitutional democracy and constitutional norms is in fact a problem. And I say that because I think that in the way of all religion, it's both very, very close by and very, very far away. We have this notion that these laws are everything. They're going to protect us, and they're everywhere. And I'm thinking, you know, I carbon date my own personal nervous breakdown to February 13th of 2016, when Justice Scalia died, and within half an hour, folks were tweeting, not going to happen, don't carry.
Not just folks. Senate majority leader.
And the soon-to-be president were tweeting, you know, whoever Obama picks is not going to get seated. And I remember thinking, but, and that's that gut thing that Neil's talking about. But that hasn't happened before. That's clearly wrong. You're not going to have a hearing? You're not going to meet the guy? We're not going to wait and hear who it is? And I think, so I've had sort of a jump, a year-long jump on the breakdown. And I feel like whenever I spoke to groups of people, that was their question. But there must be a law, right? Isn't there a legal mechanism? There must be a law. And I think that solace that we take, there must be a law. The emoluments clause, never used it before, but that's going to fix it. You know, obstruction, this incredibly inchoate statutory obstruction that we're talking about now. And this belief, this deep, abiding belief that law and lawyers in the legal system are this fail-safe apparatus that are just going to work to fix this. And therefore, I can watch cat videos. And I think that's, you know, it's a non-trivial problem that we have such a deep, you know, in some of the constitutional democracies that Aziz is describing, you know, that with constitutions that exist for 8 years, you don't have that magical thinking about your document. You know you have to fight for it. There isn't some emoluments clause that's never been litigated that you're going to dust off. There's not some magical 25th Amendment that's going to fix it because some guy's going to find it. So you fight. And here I think we have this deep sense, we believe so deeply that there is a legal structure that is going to fix everything. And we believe so deeply that other people are going to deploy that we just check out.
So I think this is the point at which I say, jump in.
Yeah.
Can I just add one word? I agree with that very much, but I mean, I do think the founders understood this. I mean, if you look at the Federalist Papers, Federalist 49 encourages reverence for the Constitution, which is a pretty amazing thing for Madison to have thought of, given that it was brand new and, as Hamilton says, something that they had come up with, very proud of the novelty of their political science that it was the basis of. But they understood the importance of that kind of reverence. But of course, in many other places in the Federalist, and God knows throughout American history, serious thinkers and statesmen have understood the importance of both citizens being responsible and serious and leaders being responsible and serious. So I think you can't have both. And I don't know if we've erred too much on one side or the other. I think people understand that figures in the executive branch, figures in Congress, judges, people in civil society have to step up as well. But just on the point about inexperience, I guess it was Paul Ryan's line, right? The way he's new to Washington, he doesn't know what he's doing. That actually, it's worse than, in a way, than you say, because, Pam, because it's totally disingenuous. I mean, Trump is making a lot of mistakes because he really doesn't understand the government, he doesn't care to learn about it, and is inexperienced. This is actually an area he knows a lot about, which is skating around the edges of the law and dealing, no, think about it, dealing with lawyers. And in fact, assuming Comey's account is accurate, which I assume it is, I mean, what Trump did with Comey is a classic sort of, reasonably knowledgeable guy who's used to playing on the edges, making sure he says, I hope you do this instead of I order you to do this. Can't you go easy? He's a good guy. So in fact, it's really, so this gets now to Dahlia's point, which is, and I guess what, in a way, you were hinting at, Ruth, when you asked me that first question, which I didn't really answer, which is, I mean, how irresponsible, or how much are Republicans in particular in Congress failing to do what they should be doing in terms of holding Trump accountable and defending constitutional norms and, not constitutional norms, but also democratic traditions and appropriate ways of conducting oneself as president. And I think there has been a failure there, obviously. Whether they'll fix that, whether that's to be somewhat excused by, the first 4 months of a new presidency and so forth, and people deferring to their own party. The founders didn't expect parties. Parties have done a lot of good. The two-party system has probably done a lot of good for America, but it has this one very perverse effect of, especially in the last 20, 30 years, of really pushing people towards a kind of putting party first. And that, I think, is a huge question over the next 2 months. I think privately my friend Mike Murphy had a good line in the New York Times this morning, which was, so after 6 p.m., of course, all the Republicans on the Hill are kind of just rolling their eyes and throwing their arms up in disgust and saying, how can this go on? But that's not really enough if you, at some point you do have to say that publicly. I think Mike's line was that now he knows what it's like to live in Vichy France, where or in Havel's, I suppose, Czechoslovakia, right, where in public everyone accepts, sort of does their duty as loyal party members, and then in private they roll their eyes. But rolling your eyes isn't enough to sustain a constitutional order.
Can I just jump in here for a second and say that, Dahlia, you date your Mitch McConnell awakening horrible moment to 2016. I date mine to 2009 when he announced that he viewed the job of the Republican Party as being to see that Barack Obama was a failure in office, not to resisting particular policies, not to pressing particular policies, but just to seeing that the president would be a failure. And so when I think of constitutional norms, we were kind of joking about this yesterday, think about, it's worse than it's worse than you think. There's a different Norm Ornstein. There's a constitutional norm for you. And his point that the kind of partisanship we have now, and this goes also Bill, to your point, which is we didn't anticipate two rigid ideological parties, and at least since since about 1880 or so, we hadn't had that in the United States. That is, the parties had always had crossover. And starting in about 2010, if you look at the Poole-Rosenthal scores, which are a kind of measure of ideology in Congress, you see the complete disappearance of any overlap between the parties. That is, when I was growing up, I grew up in Connecticut, the Republicans were often the more liberal party on a number of issues than the Democrats. Southern Democrats were far more conservative than Midwestern Republicans alike. And so the government worked in a different way than it works when you have two ideological parties. So if one party controls all three of the elected branches of the federal government, there is none of this horizontal oversight. And where the parties view their primary job as seeing that the other party fails. And that, I think, is a very different way of thinking about kind of how constitutional governance occurs than what elites thought the country's constitutional norms were in the period, say, from 1880 or 1890 forward, really, until the late 1990s, early 2000s.
I just want to say, 30 seconds, and I'll be quiet, just so I can keep my conservative credentials. My moment of horror, of course, was Teddy Kennedy's speech on the floor of the Senate, attacking the single most qualified person, nominated for the Supreme Court, probably in recent memory, Bob Bork, in 1987, and the disgraceful attack on Bob Bork, which incidentally had a lot to do, and all of its follow-ons on both sides, with what has happened in terms of the total politicization now of a process of judicial nomination that used to be much less politicized. So I just want to say that for the record here.
Do you feel better?
We don't need to engage it. We don't need to engage it.
It's like an encounter group.
So I think something that we're observing is that it's a lot easier to see violations of political norms and constitutional conventions in the other side than in one's own side. And therefore, those who are willing to call it out on one's own side I think, are some of the greatest patriots and have special authority. I want to underscore two ways in which we've just talked about that constitutional norms and conventions can be particularly vulnerable in this country. And the first, Dahlia touched on, and it's deep, and it's something that the framers didn't anticipate, which is the relationship between a written and revered Constitution and the maintenance of these norms and conventions. And the concern is about crowding out. Putting so much stock in legality, will that crowd out the maintenance of these norms? Now, I think it's overstated to say, yes, it does. It's either the Constitution or politics. But I do think it's the case that the writtenness of the Constitution, the perceived need to tie things to the emoluments clause or else anything goes, it's a vulnerability. It leads to these norms and conventions being under-respected by politicians, under-enforced by citizens at elections. The response to Merrick Garland should have been at the ballot box, right? That's the ultimate norm enforcer, and it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But the other part of this, which Pam just talked about, is political polarization, right? Where what you began with, Ruth, what is the predicament we find ourselves in? What is happening to us? It's like this Carl Schmittian notion of friend and enemy, right? That so much is perceived to be at stake that losing the next election, having the other side make the next Supreme Court appointment is simply intolerable, right? The other side is so alien to us. Democrats are not even human, is what we just recently heard from the son of the president. And I think that kind of toxicity, when conventions and norms don't do well, when so much is perceived to be at stake, that you're willing to let them go, right, in order to win in the short term. Aziz's recent paper with Tom Ginsburg on how to lose a constitutional democracy, I mean, he likens what's going on in my home state of North Carolina with the Republican legislature there, right, that is classic Hugo Chavez, which is that if you lose the governorship, you change the rules of the game in pretty fundamental ways to try and defang the governor. So much is at stake in losing the governorship temporarily, even while you control the legislature, right, that you're willing to go that far. And that, I think, I think that really speaks volumes about the situation we're in and how we've lost our way and how we need to find our way back.
So I grew up in England, and at the time that I lived in England, there was no even semblance of a written constitution. We didn't have the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I wasn't terribly political or well-informed then or now, but even I had the sense when I was growing up that there would be things that would happen that would be utterly out of the ordinary, and nobody would be quite sure if they were okay. Like poll tax? Wait, didn't we do away with that with the Peasants' Revolt? No, it can come back. Internment without trial for Catholic people? That doesn't sound okay, but they're not really clear whether it's a violation of the rules. Referendum on membership in the European Union, which might lead to economic catastrophe and national decline for the next 50 or 60 years? Maybe that's okay. Not clear whether we need a vote of parliament or not, right? So there's a flip side to writtenness that I think one should not let go of. Yeah. And if one looks at so I think Dahlia is entirely right that it has not been law that has been the thing that has stood in the way of democratic or constitutional decline in other contexts. It's been popular mobilization. There's terrific work by a political scientist called Erica Chenoweth that talks about how, in particular, peaceful, violent protest rarely works. Peaceful protest is effectual in stalling movement away from democracy, movement toward autocracy. But peaceful protest benefits from what the political scientists call focal points, right? This is the idea that if there are certain identifiable actions that, once committed, tell everyone that the situation or the behavior of those in power is unacceptable, the existence of those norms, the existence of those focal points, which are usually provided by law, is terribly important for popular mobilization. And so whereas I do think that constitutional reverence and constitutional faith is extraordinarily important, I think the way that it in practice has worked in the United States is, given that we have an extraordinarily short constitution, constitution's way, way fewer words than other constitutions, given that it was understood at the time that it was drafted to allow for a space of what Madison called liquidation, where there would be a set of norms and practices that would be developed over time in order to make the bare bones of institutional machinery work. Given those things, I resist a little bit Dahlia's framing in the sense that I do think it's important for it to be understood that there are certain norms or conventions that are not just political, but that, as Neil said, that are constitutional in the sense of being necessary for the maintenance of a democratic constitution as a going concern, and that those provide the focal points for popular mobilization. And I think that that's exactly what's being attacked in the press, or in certain parts of the press, in the coverage, for example, this morning of the Comey hearing, right? The example that I think this is how I would read the coverage that Dahlia describes, that this is an effort to take what otherwise has been a focal point, which has this, if not fully constitutional, then quasi-constitutional character, and to snap it away. But that I think is necessarily a risk in a world or in a polity with a free media. That just is a risk.
So I'm gonna say a word that improbably enough has not been said on this panel yet, and it's the word truth. Because I think that undergirding this larger conversation about is it politics, is it law, is it the Constitution, where does it come from, I think what has been so fundamentally destabilized is the norms of truth. And I think Neil flicked at this, but I certainly think that if you look at what is systematically being dismantled, it's truth-seeking. And whether that's assaults on the press, be they formal assaults on the press by who we now credential, who we lock out of press hearings, or informal assaults like actual assaults, which are congratulated and rewarded, or assaults on the courts and their truth-seeking function and their independence, or assaults on the truth-seeking entity that is the FBI director. I think that to not understand that underpinning at least some of what Aziz is talking about here is that if you read certain media accounts of what happened yesterday, many media accounts, the one definitive thing that happened is that Russia isn't a story. That Jim Comey confirmed yesterday that there is no Russian interference with the election. And that's, I don't know, maybe Bill disagrees. I feel that that is empirically not true. But the fact that that is the story that is pushed out in order to support the narrative that Neil and Pam are talking about, I think is the most destabilizing thing. It has everything to do with norms. And we don't have a way to cabin anymore the conversation about truth.
So I'm going to use a word that I think is probably requisite to use on all ACS panels, which is conflate. When we're talking about norms, and you've brought up two that I think are really interesting, one is experience, and the other is truth-telling, that it's a really interesting, those are certainly, well, other presidents have lied, though perhaps not to this extent. No president has been this inexperienced. But it raises the question for me that I'm going to throw out there of when we talk about norms and when we talk about the role that norms should play in figuring out what government, Congress, the country should do going forward, are we conflating two different kinds of norms? Are there more kind of constitutionally inspired and based norms that we should be concentrating on? Or is it this kind of broader truth-telling norm that we should also talk about? And I guess in that context, I'd invite you guys to sort of jump in on which norm or norms are most alarming to you, slash, do you think that Congress, the media, the country should be concentrating on as we, what's your favorite norm violation that's going on here that you really think is relevant?
I got a favorite.
Take it away. I can actually now get off the stage because you guys will be self-actuating from now on.
So my candidate for norm that has been violated that is most critical is the norm of a belief in democracy. We have a president who fundamentally doesn't believe in it. How do we know this? I'm going to look back to the campaign, and I know that his lawyers, the Justice Department lawyers of the Supreme Court, say you can't look at anything he said before he was president because that's before he took the oath of office, and the oath of office changes a person. Look at page 28 of the government's cert petition in the travel ban case, on which they say, well, everything he said before doesn't count because once you take the oath of office, it changes a person. And what we've now discovered is, no, it doesn't. Sometimes maybe it does, but it doesn't here. So here's how we know that he doesn't believe in democracy. Threatening to put your opponent in jail when you're running, saying that you will only accept the result of the election if you win, believing that despite all of the evidence, you won the popular vote because there's massive vote fraud, creating a commission to look into voting in the United States that is so stacked with people who have already announced that they think that there are huge numbers of unqualified people voting as opposed to being worried about the number of qualified people who can't vote, right? Not believing in the rule of law, we have a president...
So-called judges.
So-called judges. I mean, we have a president who, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, does not even give lip service to the idea that this country is a democracy and that people should participate in the government and that you need a free press. So instead of the Declaration of Independence, we hold this alternative reality to be self-evident. And that really worries me because I think that when the elite tells the people, don't believe in democracy, it's very hard to pull that back. And that's the norm. Just the belief that this country is a country of self-government that has been blown through by this president and that I think has to be reclaimed.
If I could, I agree with every particular Pam says, but I think, honestly, it's a little too easy to say that that's democracy. Because everyone likes democracy, and it's not simply democracy. It's also the rule of law, and the rule of law is not entirely coincident with democracy and many other things, as you know.
Sure right.
So I think we need to be, and I think the single best thing people could do is therefore remind their fellow citizens that it's not simply about, quote, democracy in the vulgar sense, at least, of, one vote, one time kind of thing, or one vote even every 4 years kind of thing. That it is we have a much more complex liberal democracy, to use a word that maybe hasn't been used either. I think if you all could stop being progressives and be liberals again, it would be much healthier for the country, honestly. Because, in fact, progressivism is hostile to that kind of liberal constitutionalism, either hostile or, let's say, indifferent, maybe, to the kind of constitutional norms, habits, constraints that are so important, that I think we're rediscovering on both sides now are so important. So I agree with all the particulars about Trump, obviously. I don't think it's about... But I just think we don't... I don't think it... my only advice would be, therefore, we need to rebuild the notion of a complex, constitutional, liberal, law-guided democracy with all kinds of other institutions that, ranging from, I would say, limited government is a more conservative way of saying the same thing, perhaps. That's not, people are reminded, and separation of powers, and federalism, and decentralization. All these things turn out to be kind of useful if you want to preserve liberty, at least, I think, in the American context. Anyway, not everyone has to sign on to each of these things, and they're all they're complex, and they have been brought together in an unusually successful way so far in America. We shouldn't kid ourselves, though, that if we just say the word democracy, I'm not saying you're saying this, but
I'm starting to feel like we're in Candide. Oh, happy pair, oh, happy we. It's very rare how we agree. But in this best of all possible worlds.
That was impressive.
Yeah, but
I'm revising my low opinion of law school professors here.
I burst into song all the time, and the thing that worries me is we've got a president who wants to sing "Tomorrow Belongs to Me."
So
I've got
I think we should let Pam go for another 10 or 15 minutes.
I've got a laundry list of political norms and constitutional conventions that the current president has disregarded since entering political life. It's in an academic paper. I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested. But, right, Ruth, your question is, what's the most serious, the most important, the most destabilizing? And I think the answer is what Dahlia said. I think it's a refusal to accept the existence or relevance of the category of truth itself. Right? Truth itself is a category of political life. There's a lot of talk yesterday about who do you believe. It's he said, and when someone utters, all politicians spin the truth, right? But it's the truth that they're spinning. And many politicians utter misstatements or false statements on occasion. Right? But you have someone now who does it incessantly with machine gun frequency. It's about the size of his crowd at his inauguration. It's about the magnitude of his electoral college victory. It's about crime data. It's about employment statistics. I mean, it's about the previous president wiretapping him, an impeachable offense. Right? I mean, Obama wiretapped me is an opinion, right, to which the current president feels entitled, and regarding which he feels entitled to become defensive about when a reporter merely points out that there's no evidence at all. I mean, we're talking about someone who entered political life, right, by uttering incessantly the very arguably racist lie that the current president is not a natural-born citizen. That's what we're talking about. And I think, democracy is important. We haven't talked about corruption and the refusal to disjoin private interests from public service. We haven't talked about a number of things. But if you're not going to accept the existence or relevance of truth, then we're not just talking about a personal ethical failing. We're not just talking about a political norm. I think we're talking about a constitutional convention. Think about the unchecked power that the President of the United States will possess if enough other institutions acquiesce in his apparent belief that he's entitled to his own facts. Think about how important it is in the face of a crisis to which only the president can respond effectively and regarding which only the president possesses full information, that there actually be trust in the president, a need to believe what he's actually telling us. Is there any reason any American has to believe almost anything or maybe anything he says at this point? The way Eric Posner put it, simply but powerfully, is that the president's authority rests on trust and discretion, not on triumph of the will. That, to me, is a problem of constitutional magnitude.
Wow.
So you think the president even knows that there is such a thing as the truth? I mean, what worries me here is you sort of talk about, well, people say things they know to be false. What worries me with him is I don't think the category of truth versus falsity necessarily is something baked into him.
Well, before we had Pam, I think that it's by destabilizing truth for himself. The only response, as Neil suggests, the rational response is to doubt the truthfulness of him, and that means doubting the truthfulness of anything. I mean, it is the only logical response to a destabilization of truth is to have destabilized truth yourself. And I think that the ripple effect of this, what's frightening, is that, it's true. We have to decide, do we take him literally or do we take him seriously? Or do we take the tweets to be, presidential speech acts or not? And the mere ontological debate about is he lying, when is he lying, how can we know when he's lying, it rests entirely on him.
But I don't.
And we've ceded that.
But it seems to me, Dahlia, that you're underemphasizing all the different institutions of civil society, the mainstream media, the courts, the academy, right? Some of the most important institutions of our society are pushing back.
But what
in
I'm
fact,
saying,
most people don't believe him that he won the popular vote.
What I'm saying is watch those institutions. Those are the ones that he destabilizes. It's not an accident that this conversation is happening with those exact entities.
Those are the ones he's attempting to destabilize. I think the jury is still out on how successful he's going to be. And I think there's reason for cautious optimism if all these other institutions push back and stick up for one another, that in 2018 and 2020, we might see candidates strongly reaffirming norms and conventions. Of course, we're going to release our tax returns, right, as a very strong reaction to what we're witnessing now.
So my friend David Strauss told me the other day that he had a conversation with somebody who's a long-standing lawyer in the Solicitor General's office. And the lawyer in the Solicitor General's office said, you know, the thing that's really, really depressing for me is that I have spent my 20, 30-year career defending and building up precedent and rules and expectations and judicial attitudes of deference to the president, because I believe that is the best way to run a modern democracy, right? And that clearly is a contestable view, but that's what he's done. We have, in the last 50 or 60 years, and progressives have been part of this, but Republicans and conservatives have too, built up a system of government where the president has enormous, not just lawful authority, but rhetorical authority. And the two are intertwined. And the problem with having a specific individual who is either psychologically or dispositionally unwilling or incapable of distinguishing the fact of the matter in the world from the not fact of the matter in the world is that because they occupy this unique position in the federal government, and I think it's unique in a way that the framers didn't anticipate, that has concatenating ripple effects across institutions. This is why somebody like a McMaster's will stand up and say, no, the president didn't say this. This is why a Rosenstein will stand up and say, oh, the reasons for the Comey firing were this, right? Those are the indicia of the important role that the president has in calibrating a whole series of our legal institutions. And so this is, I think, halfway between what Neil is saying and what Dahlia is saying, that it's true that there's this unique individual, but the unique individual is standing at the helm of a large institutional apparatus over which they have enormous influence, and which, over the course of the last 60 or 70 years, has accrued legal and moral and rhetorical authority. And this is the work of liberals, this is the work of conservatives, it's the work of progressives. Everyone is culpable of this. And now we see that it is capable of having these massively destabilizing effects. So I have one more sort of warning. If one looks back at other instances of democratic backsliding, and one looks at the role of lawyers, right? So you can go back all the way to the canonical example of late Weimar Germany, early Nazi Germany. Karl Lowenstein, who was an academic who fled from Germany, writes in the Yale Law Review, look at all these jurists who were liberal in the small L sense, Weimar jurists, who are going along with the keep apart the human rights questions, going along with the consolidation of one-party rule. If one looks at the current crop of autocrats, people like Putin in Russia, people like Orban, people like Erdogan in Turkey, a majority of them are lawyers. And all of them have phalanxes of US-trained lawyers. US-trained lawyers, trained at Chicago, trained at Stanford, trained at Duke,
Who's that dude?
Who's the Stanford person?
Okay.
I think they're all from Yale.
It was Yale, fine. Well, we already knew they didn't believe in the rule of law.
They wouldn't have been as effective if they were from Yale.
One would have wished. It is the lawyers. It is the lawyers that are the sharp edge of the wedge with respect to the rule of law, legality, the systemic values that are at stake. And so it is a genuinely hard question that I really don't know the answer to, as to how to think about the relationship between law and rules and legality. Right? And this actually goes back to something that, so Neil mentioned Carl Schmitt, the Nazi-era jurist. Schmitt pointed this out in a book in the mid-1920s. He said, look, you can always use law against legality. You can always unravel the system using the tools the system gives you.
So I want to ask a question about one of the tools the system gives us, which is impeachment, which is, if it's not the elephant in the room, it's certainly started to intrude its trunk into the room. What is the role of norms in thinking about impeachment? Is being chronically dishonest an impeachable offense? Or is there something else going on here that might not violate, rise to the level of an obstruction case? But is a violation of a norm a potentially impeachable offense?
Maybe I'll not answer that question, but just say a word and let these people think more for the next 2 minutes about what the right answer to that is. I mean, I think this is a complicated moment for reasons that have just come up, I think, in a very interesting and informative way on the panel, which is, on the one hand, Trump is unique, I think, in terms of the total, not more than disregard for truth, but the systemic effort to, let's say, delegitimize or I don't know what you want to valorize something, truth. And that's goes beyond, I would say, even the preceding efforts, other presidents in that respect. And you put, and the whole, that's why so many people, Republicans, I think some at least, couldn't vote for Trump for the first time or whatever. Trump is qualitatively different. I think it's foolish not to recognize that on the one hand. And that gets to, let's say, the truth issue. On the other hand, I think one should be careful about what are the implications of that. He is president. He may get impeached and convicted, but he may not, and I suppose if you were just being objective, you wouldn't want to say the odds are better than 50-50. So then I do come back to Neil's point. I mean, whether one wants to be semi-optimistic or semi-pessimistic, it's not we should all expose the lies, and I'm very sympathetic, and it's a sort of matter of political theory and, sort of regime-level discussion to the Havel, Sharansky, Orwell-type argument about the importance of the truth undermining a regime of lies and so forth. But in the real world, we really need to think hard about the actual institutions that can constrain Trump and the president and strengthen other sectors of both the executive branch and other parts of the federal government and other governments and obviously many, many other institutions in the United States. Because simply saying we've never seen anything like this before, it's unbelievable, he's trying to delegitimize truth is absolutely true, but it doesn't get you anywhere. So I'm very much with Neil in the and I think that's where where honestly law professors, lawyers could think in important ways about, not asking institutions to do things you don't want to ask them to do because then you set your own precedential problems, obviously, but at least encouraging them to be serious about taking on their full responsibilities, whether they're in the executive branch or in Congress, which gets to the impeachment question about whether I suppose in effect, the standard should be somewhat changed or not be viewed as legalistically, if that's really what you're suggesting, as it has been. And I'm open to that as a theoretical matter. I mean, in the real world, when you need 2/3 of the Senate to convict, I suspect the informal norm is that you sort of need a smoking gun. You need to clear a lie under oath, basically, or something a clear order to abuse power. I mean, I don't think, for example, let me put it this way. So I'm anti-Trump, I'm pro-Comey and all this. I think, though, firing Comey, it's hard to see how that's an impeachable offense. I mean, he certainly did it because of Russia. He certainly did it because he was so furious at Comey not being willing to go along with impeding or constraining or shaping the Russia investigation. But I think, just if you think of the Nixon example or whatever, you'd need evidence of Trump or Trump agents doing more to actually impede the investigation, which is that there's a new head of the FBI and the investigation is chugging along, or in this case, under the special counsel. It's pretty, it's an act of frustration by Trump, but if it doesn't go beyond the firing, and assuming he nominated someone respectable to replace him, it's a little hard to see that you're going to get 2/3 of the Senate to convict someone for that alone. So that's where I think, again, we need not, I'm a little worried that everyone's going to now put their eggs in the impeachment basket and forget about all the other things that need to be happening at the congressional level, at the intra-executive branch level, at the, obviously all these other aspects of American society to help us make it through what could be 4 whole years.
Okay, guys, smoking gun or smoking norm?
So, I think, let me begin with Aziz's last observation about the role of lawyers abroad, and I would say the role of lawyers at home in facilitating bad behavior. And by bad, I mean breaches of important political norms or constitutional conventions, because I think it does speak to maybe ways in which legal education needs to change. Maybe we law professors need to be speaking to future politicians and their lawyers and not just future judges, that a restraining role morality that we think applies to judges might also apply to elected officials as well. What do we know about impeachment? We know that it has to be more than simply political policy disagreement, otherwise the constitutional structure doesn't make any sense. You need a majority in the House to impeach, but you need 2/3 to override a presidential veto, right? We also know that it doesn't have to be actual criminality, including a lie under oath. These are political crimes. The Constitution expressly makes it a political process, with the House impeaching and the Senate trying it and deciding whether or not to remove the president. When we don't have a lot of other forms of constitutional authority, what we tend to do is rely a lot on historical practice, on the kinds of past behavior of government officials out of which norms and conventions arise. And I think what's relevant here is both past impeachments as well as other forms of historical practice. And so one idea I'm puzzling over, although I wouldn't say it's mainstream at this point, is that repeated violations of important constitutional conventions, right, not a one-off, but that might be a legitimate ingredient in determining whether or not impeachment is warranted. So it might not just be, right, a few falsehoods, but the machine gun frequency. It might not just be firing the FBI director, which happened once before during the presidency of Bill Clinton, but the more it gets very close to the line of obstruction of justice, the more it is done in order to defang or diffuse a criminal investigation into the president and his associates. That seems to me to be at least a potential candidate, not simply because it's a personal ethical failing, but because of how inextricably tied it is to the responsibility the Constitution places on the president to maintain the rule of law. Right? I think the more you have an accumulation, and there are a lot of them. We haven't talked, again, a lot about corruption, a lot about the populating the White House with family members, populating the cabinet with an unprecedented number of billionaires, repeatedly showing up at your properties and drawing attention to them, refusing to release your tax returns, and therefore we don't know how the president and his family are personally going to benefit from tax cuts for the. I mean, there's a lot going on that maybe all things together might qualify as grounds for impeachment. And so I think the historical practice is relevant, but it's not just past impeachments, it's also violations of these norms and conventions. And so if I can introduce a word, it's anti-constitutional, right? It's not just constitutional or unconstitutional, it's anti-constitutional behavior. Behavior that undermines the basic purposes and functioning of the Constitution. And if you have enough of that, maybe that qualifies as impeachable.
Can I make one point that I think is more responsive to Bill's than Neil? It's Bill adjacent. And that is, I think what I've been puzzling over, and it's funny, we haven't talked much about the judicial branch other than sort of theoretically being destabilized. I think maybe a little bit of my answer to sort of Bill's comment that we have to disaggregate, these institutions that exist to check and the madness of Trump. And I think the most interesting iteration of that problem is watching the judicial branch struggle with what should be a purely easy exercise in, executive power and making national security decisions. This is not complicated. We have precedent. And the inflection into that of the tweets and the campaign statements and the more tweets and the crazier tweets. And watching the judicial branch, I was at the Fourth Circuit, to tell judges to blinker themselves to what Bill is describing as, sort of its own thing is so fraught because judges, I think, are in this absolutely untenable position where they have to choose. Is this about an academic question about executive authority, or is this about, the animus that taints, the undergirding thinking about the origins of the travel ban? And it's a binary question in some ways.
No, I don't know. So I misspoke if you thought I was advocating blinkering. I was sort of the opposite. I was trying to make the point that on the one hand, I don't think you can blinker. On the other hand, I don't think you can just say he's a loathsome human being and lies constantly and said these repulsive things on the campaign trail, so we're throwing out the executive order. Now, I mean, courts, I do think it's been interesting what's happening in the courts, and I defer to other people about the details of that, but they're clearly struggling with how to accommodate responding to these executive orders, but trying to do so within something of a defensible historical context. It's not like animus has never been considered, I believe, in cases of statutory constitutional interpretation and so forth. So, I mean, I do think it's important for the sake of the constitutional order as a whole as much as possible in resisting this somewhat anti-constitutional president, to do so in a constitutionally defensible way, if not a constitutionally literal way. I mean, there's a sort of Lincolnian moment here where you still preserve the Constitution if you have to. I don't object to people having to stretch a little bit, though, to accommodate what are genuinely unusual circumstances. So this is a case where some judicial statesmanship of a kind may be needed, but that would also be true of people in the executive branch. I mean, there are genuine, the only thing I'd caution people here, I actually know some of the people in the executive branch. I think they have tough choices, some of them. I have a lot of young friends who wonder, should they go in, should they not go in? And generally, I was against going in if you're working directly for Trump. If you're going in to help, keep the foreign policy of the United States on path, if you're going in to, help make FDA drug approval better or whatever, I think there's a case for serving the country in that way. And I think it's hard to judge, and it is a judgment call. And someone like McMaster, made an unfortunate judgment and my mistake by going out to defend Trump. If you still ask me tomorrow, and I do know McMaster a little, if I were with him privately, should he resign or not, I would be inclined to say no, because I think he's probably, the replacement of Flynn by McMaster, it was probably the single best thing that's happened in the Trump presidency if you actually care about, maintaining some reasonable liberal world order and not letting things just spin out of control out there. That doesn't mean that 6 months from now, if Trump has ordered McMaster to do A, B, or C, or has ordered others to do A, B, or C and put McMaster in the position of having to defend it, that he shouldn't make a different decision. I just think we need to be somewhat, it is complex. Maybe we'll get a moment, where the red light goes off or the yellow, whatever, the green light goes off and everyone agrees, well, that, Nixon kind of the, August moment with Nixon or something, and the whole world agrees, well, that's just totally untenable. It would probably be good if we got such a moment. But I'm not sure right now, just looking, who knows, but looking at the circumstances, that we will. And that will make life complicated over the next 3 years.
This takes us back, Aziz, to something you said earlier about the lawyers that I just wanted to kind of highlight, both about lawyers and about people generally, which is the kind of the metaphor that people use often, or the image people use often, is the frog in the pot of water, right? Which is, people went into the Trump administration thinking, I can control this guy, I can, bring a certain amount of sanity to things. And once you're in, I highly recommend to any of you who haven't read it yet, there's a David Luban blog post about should people go in or shouldn't they? And it's about how once you're on the inside, you start to feel a sense of solidarity with the administration, a sense of solidarity with your colleagues who seem at lunch like very nice people. And so over time, you have a kind of moral drift.
Stockholm syndrome.
What?
Stockholm syndrome.
Well, if you're actually held captive, but right. But so there's that moral drift, and I think we're starting to see that drift also among people. That is, every day Trump says something outrageous, and people go, at least it's not as outrageous as the day before thing or the like. I remember this during the campaign, where he would say things, and you would think, okay, that's the end. Mm-hmm. When he mocked John McCain for having been shot down. When he made fun of the reporter with the disability, when, the infamous tapes about him grabbing women came out, and you kept thinking... The Mexican judge, the rapist, all of the Mexican... Donald Trump has sexually assaulted more women than 99.99% of all of the people who've entered this country illegally. By himself, he's done more, right? And yet, I'm serious that... and people have stopped thinking about it because it's just like every day it's a new one, and I worry about that because I think that may stop us from ever getting to the red light moment. It's like you just keep slouching towards Gomorrah, to quote your favorite, and my con law professor, so clearly he was not as good a con law professor as me, because look at how much I agree with him.
I think he would have welcomed that, I'm sure.
I was on a panel with him, I learned.
I think Bill is right, though, that to focus on impeachment now, it is ultimately political, and if you're making predictions, it's not going to happen for the time being. Think about the debate over health care and the town halls over health care. Think about 2018, think about 2020, right? There's a variety of ways in which pushback and more effective pushback can take place than thinking that a Republican House is going to impeach this president and that a Republican Senate, right, 2/3 of the Senate is actually going to convict him.
So this actually leads very well into this excellent first question, which has to do with the role of the electorate and the people's choice. To what extent is the problem that large segments of the U.S. population don't care about or actively dislike existing political norms and conventions, and thus don't care much about the president's flouting of them. And I guess I would add to that, I mean, it is not a surprise to anybody who watched the campaign that the president doesn't tell the truth. He was elected president under our electoral college system, notwithstanding that. Does anybody want to jump in on whether the population really cares about norms and conventions and what we make of that?
The population is a they, not an it, right? And right now his approval rating is what, 34%, right? So
38.
38.
Give him 38.
40.
36.
I mean, I'll give him 40.
75, he says.
Right. But it's the beginning. I mean, so look, I think there is an important part of his base of support. I don't know how large it is. I know it's not large enough to win another election, even taking into account the rural favoritism baked into the Electoral College, right? That loves the behavior. They call it shaking it up. I think of mixing dangerous chemicals together to cause an explosion, right? But they have a different image in mind that the worse he behaves, he's showing that he's not a politician, he's an outsider, he speaks for them. But I don't think that's why independents tended to vote for him. I don't think that's why disgruntled Democrats tended to vote for him. And it's like sporting events. It's a very close game. It turns on luck. And then after the game is over, you start telling these narratives about the American people and what they care about, right? If not for Comey, if not for Russia, if not for Bill Clinton and that meeting on the plane with the Attorney General, I mean, if not for the email fiasco, if not for any number of things, I mean, he ends up winning by a football stadium's worth of people in 3 Midwestern states. And so given where his approval rating is at the beginning of his presidency, the idea that the American people simply don't care about this seems to me to be quite overstated.
But don't you? Oh, go ahead.
No, but I think it is worth remembering that there is that 37%. And I think that liberals, political liberals, have a deep problem in how to think about the presence of that population within the larger policy. I mean, what we know from the polling data is that there's a large number of people who are not, it's not people who are affected directly by globalization and by economic dislocation. It's people who are earning a little bit less than the national median income, who are largely high school educated but not college educated, who live in rural areas where there's relatively little racial diversity, and I think this is maybe the most important fact, whose expected lifespan is declining. This is the Kaysen-Deaton finding. It is this pool of, there is a substantial pool of people that feel that the American project does not work for them. And I think that on the one hand, there is a well of deep sympathy among progressives and liberals for the predicament that those people find themselves in. On the other hand, I think that there has been a failure to understand and to speak to those people, leaving open voices that can say to that population, it is the fault of the Mexican, it is the fault of the Syrian immigrant, it is the fault of the elites, right? The people assembled in Washington ballrooms who are taking away your jobs. And if you just listen to me, I will remove the Mexicans, remove the Muslims, and it's a long, long list that follows that.
You're talking about two different things, Aziz. You're talking about economic anxiety and cultural anxiety. And I think political liberals, qua political liberals, can speak to their economic anxiety in ways that liberal politicians haven't always done effectively, in ways that Joe Biden has been calling for a reinvigoration of. I think cultural anxiety, which is my understanding of what most of the post-election polls are showing, that America was better in the 50s, I don't recognize my country, really go after illegal immigrants, right? The stuff that's tinged with racism and xenophobia, I think that really puts pressure on political liberals and their commitments in a way that the economic anxiety does not.
So I think my point would be rather that liberals have tended to distinguish between economic and cultural forms of anxiety and not recognize how entangled they are in practice and effect. And working out how to disentangle It's not a project of the law. It's, as you say, a project of politics.
Yeah.
Although I think the law, and in particular the way we talk about discrimination and disadvantage, has a large role to play in it. I think that's terribly difficult. But I don't think it is enough to say, well, there's just people who are economically disadvantaged, or people who are economically disaffected and people who are culturally disaffected, and these are two completely separate things. They're not. They're not. They're very closely entangled with each other sociologically.
Let me try to squeeze in a few more questions, because there's some really good questions here. When/if we suffer from the next terror attack or a national emergency, which norms and conventions must we weaponize to prevent the catalyzation of democratic backsliding at an increased pace? I think it's a really important question, because I think, let's hope that moment doesn't come, but it could.
But I would just make an obvious point that everyone's counting on the courts at that moment, and I think what was done by lawyers and the courts was impressive that first weekend after Trump issued the executive order. On the other hand, we should also be serious about the norms and practices and rules and laws that govern the institutions that Trump presumably would mobilize to do his whatever things he wants to do after such an attack. It's not, and people do sort of jump a little bit from, there'll be a horrible attack, God forbid, and then Trump will do X, Y, or Z. Well, Trump doesn't really do anything. He orders people to do things. And I don't think James Mattis will obey a clearly unconstitutional or illegal order to deploy U.S. troops domestically to do X, Y, or Z. I don't know about, the Justice Department's more complicated. The FBI might be more complicated. CIA, I think, has a pretty good culture, actually, these days, I would say, of law-abidingness and norm-abidingness, but someone should really, I think being more focused on some of those intra-executive branch laws, rules, regulations, and norms, and people should actually take a look at what exists, and I'm no expert on this at all. There's a whole network of things that have been built up over the last decades, but maybe they need to be strengthened, and that's something that actually Congress can do, and it's actually something that people could propose. So I don't think we're simply sort of helplessly hoping the courts stop him or public opinion stops him from doing something.
Everybody else calm?
I think what worries me is that his initial reaction to whatever it is going to be to blame Muslims, to blame immigrants, to scapegoat the courts, and the like, and the media. And so what worries me is, imagine that the next disaster is something like the Oak bombing. He's going to claim it was Muslims. And there's going to be backlash, and there are going to be all kinds of problems there. Look at the fact that we haven't had a mass terrorist attack in the United States, but we've had some pretty serious crimes since he's become president. And look at how long it took him to say anything about the stabbing of those two men on the metro train in Portland. His natural reaction, and I think there are people who are writing stuff about this now, is part of why he's trying to destabilize the courts is so there will be somebody else to blame rather than him if something goes wrong.
But I agree with that, but he will do that, I imagine. Unfortunately, he will. But the Portland thing, doesn't it also cut the other way? There actually is a police force in Portland. There actually is a mayor in Portland. There actually is a state government. And they seem to have behaved quite responsibly. And I don't think Trump won. And I don't think Trump won the narrative on that particularly.
No, I don't think he won the narrative.
So I think that's not a bad example. We're not really disagreeing, but it's not a bad example of the fact that we all think he's so. He is very powerful, as he says. The president's more powerful than ever. The bully pulpit side of it is unfortunately probably much more powerful than it used to be. We've always had a problem with demagogues, but we haven't really had a demagogue like him. We've had them in the Senate and in governors' mansions. We haven't really had a demagogue like him as president, so it's a bad situation. But it's also the case that luckily his direct power is somewhat limited. This is where, again, I come back to, you can't solve everything, but really bolstering the institutions that can check. We probably can't shame him into not behaving badly, but we can check the consequences of his not behaving badly.
We know from history, right, that courts become more vulnerable after attacks, particularly after major terrorist attacks. So one concern is by attacking the courts in response to his immigration executive orders, by attacking the media, he's prospectively trying to engage in blame shifting in the event of an attack. Don't look at me, look at them. I'm worried about something else, right, something more troubling, which is creating a narrative that he can then evoke after an attack. Imagine another 9/11. Imagine, too, that he can used to rally a fearful public behind a disregard of judicial authority. Now, I think you make an important point that he couldn't do it himself. And at a certain point, executive officials will get off the boat. But these attacks on the media for underreporting terrorist attacks, see nothing, right? The attacks on the courts for, some of the claims about just denying us the safety and security to which we're entitled. I think if you got to the point where the executive branch either wouldn't comply with or enforce a federal court order, I think then we'd have a constitutional crisis. We're not anywhere near there now, but it is more plausible. It is something to worry about in a way that it has not been for a very long time. And things can really change in terms of his public approval rating, popular support after an attack. And the time to start thinking about it is now, beforehand, to really shore up these institutions. At every time he blames someone else, say, actually, Mr. President, you're responsible for the security failings of this administration. You're the one who didn't properly vet your executive order. You're the one who didn't give the courts anything institutionally to defer to. Right? You're the one who is blaming the media for doing their jobs in the hope, right? And it's a hope. It's not a guarantee that after a major attack, these institutions will have the kind of backbone, the kind of spine, the kind of public support that they will require to speak law, to speak truth to power.
But I just, one quick caveat to what Neil is saying, which is the difference between the military and the FBI and the security apparatus and the courts and the media, on the other hand, is you're talking about two institutions that have very little power and very little power to protect themselves. And to the extent that they have power, the power rests in public confidence and trust, which circles back to the truth problem. And I think it's so important to just notice that in the entirety of the Trump efforts to destabilize individual judges, justices, the courts, we've heard virtually nothing from judges in response. That judges, Ruth Bader Ginsburg got out ahead of this last July and took back a burnt paw. That judges and justices do not think it's seemly for them to respond to attacks on the courts. That the media has not, I think to a lesser degree, done a great job of answering these attacks. And that institutionally, it's important to understand that these are institutions that don't necessarily have language and structures to answer the kinds of attacks Neil's talking about. And also, they are so deeply reliant on public trust and nothing else, that the very act of the drip that Pam's talking about is already undermining that institution.
And so here comes the next question, which you've touched on. How can we effectively engage citizens to care more about constitutional norms and conventions? Or are we too far gone and doomed to an electorate that will care more about, there we go, cat videos. I have to confess to watching a few over the last couple of days.
There's nothing wrong with
that. It's very common. Yeah.
I have live cats. I don't need videos.
So, what is to be done prospectively, as the president clearly has prospectively blamed?
So there's a short term and a long term. I don't know exactly in the short term, so I'd love to hear what other people on the panel have. In the long term, this is a point that Justice O'Connor made after she retired from the court. We need better civic education in the United States. That is, even in law schools, I'm often shocked by what students don't know about American constitutional history or what they don't know about basic government structures or the like. And if people understood these things better, they could have better debates about them. And we have given up completely on any real kind of civic education. And I think in the long term, that's one of the things that we need to be pressing for, is for people to understand both kind of government structure, but also American history. Because, in addition to all of the overseas work that you've done, Aziz, it'd be really interesting for our students to know more about the disappearance of democracy in the South in the period after 1870, from about 1870 to about 1900, because we've seen the destabilization of democracies in the United States. It's not just, across the sea from us. And people don't know any of this history. And if they knew it better, they might be more likely to resist kind of encroachments today. Now, that's the long term. In the short term, I don't really have a solution. But I have a long-term solution, and that should count for something.
Aziz, are there examples, I think this one is best directed to you, are there examples of democratic backsliding where a country managed to restore democratic legitimacy without war? If there are, how? Please say yes.
Name 5.
Argentina is the one that immediately comes to mind. Depending on what period of time you're talking about.
I mean, there was backsliding in the middle.
There was backsliding in the
70s,
in the 1970s.
They're pretty good democracy now. So.
Yeah, there are.
I have a low bar here.
Right. There are multiple examples from Latin America in particular of rulers coming into power on the basis of personalistic, populist politics. And I think that much of what we have been discussing implicitly is about the interaction of liberal constitutionalism and populism, which is a style of politics that orients or mobilizes large masses of people in opposition to an elite that is styled as corrupt and that is working hand in glove with some dangerous other. And Latin American democracies have ebbed and flowed. There have been instances of protracted periods of military rule in Chile and Argentina, Brazil, where there have been very, very serious human rights violations through the course of military rule, and where peaceful protest, continued advocacy, and mobilization by journalists, civic leaders at local and state levels, lawyers, has made a real difference over time. But at the same time, one cannot but notice the real and enormous human costs of those periods of backsliding in these Latin American democracies. There are countless tragedies of people who died, people who were tortured, people whose children were taken from them when they never saw them again. Those human rights violations are endemic to instances of democratic backsliding. Lawyers, importantly, can do something at the edges to slow them down. It's a shock that when you start to read the actual histories of autocracies and military dictatorships, there are still lawyers representing people. There are still lawyers going to, for example, Turkish prisons today and dickering over whether this person or their wife or their son should be detained, whether they be allowed to get a passport. And 1 or 2 or 3 people get helped. And I think that role of lawyers is easy to forget because those lawyers are not effectuating systemic change, but they are keeping alive some measure of hope in very dark times. And it may well be that is the role that lawyers in the United States play. It may well be that the role of lawyers in the United States is not to save the system, but to fish out whatever they can find of bodies from the wreckage.
Can I say a word about saving the system? I think I'm not quite as pessimistic as that. But I think so I very much agree with Pam on civic education. I would broaden it to be civic culture, and there are some things we can do things about, and there are other things that may just be 21st century technology and 21st century other things. I mean, I was struck, the thing I missed the most when Trump won the Republican nomination, which I didn't think he would, was just pure power of his celebrity. I mean, that just people like celebrities. They conflate being, to use Ruth's term, a celebrity with being successful, with being capable, with being someone they should support. And it was horrifying to go to rallies for Trump and say, well, why are you supporting him? Well, because he really knows what he's doing. He can run the government like a business, leaving aside all the problems with that. I would say, well, why do you think he's so good at running a business, really? So, well, I saw him on TV. And, how do you even begin to sort of talk about, well, that's a reality show and stuff. So I think there are deep problems, and I actually think it would be healthy on both sides of the political aisle if we were less worshipful, so to speak, of the public and less hesitant to say that there are real problems in our civic education, our civic culture, and many other aspects of the public. I also very much agree that we should not whitewash American history. And if we want to look at examples, incidentally, coming back from, let's call it a semi-authoritarian, illiberal regime, one of the best examples is in America in the mid-20th century in the South, right? I mean, that would presumably be something of a case study. But I think it's also important not to be I mean, who knows at some deep level what's fatal, what's inevitable and what's not. But I think it's important not to be fatalistic about this. These things are often very contingent. I think this is true about the transition to authoritarianism, too. Afterwards, the political scientists come and they discover that the following 12 factors were there in this case and weren't in this case. But in the real world, and this is true of Weimar, it's true of the South, I think it's true of the South both in the 1890s and in the 1950s, actual people, not just lawyers, but political leaders, civic leaders, others could have made a difference at some very key times, and sometimes did, incidentally, and sometimes didn't. And I think that really, I think we might be at a moment. So I'm not, in that respect, I'm less pessimistic because I think we still have a pretty strong, it's not a third world country, if I can put it that way. We're not Argentina. Yeah. And we have a very deep...
I think the Argentinians would have.
No, I always say this, and then I apologize to any Argentinians in the audience, but I don't mean it looks not their fault, really, not the ones who are living now, it's fault, I mean, but we do have a deep, structure of institutions, norms, habits, history that I think helps us a lot more than a young democracy, whether it's in Hungary or Argentina or other places, or during the Arab Spring, Tunisia or Egypt or something like that. We should take advantage of those deep structures that are pretty well embedded, pretty well respected by the citizenry for all their lack of education and their flaws, have some real credibility despite the fact that Trump may be eroding that. And I think if you look at that, I think with some decent actions by people who are not too fatalistic about this, and with some strategic thought, obviously, about where the best leverage points are, which I have no magic solutions on this, to check Trump, to make sure he doesn't succeed in delegitimizing certain things. I mean, maybe judges should speak out more. I'm sort of not sure. Or maybe others should speak out more on their behalf, because there's a look if they're just speaking out while they're defending their, privileged position, and what's new about that. And so, I mean, thinking a little more strategically about how to bolster the checks and constraints on Trump would be important. But I think they are bolsterable.
I'm hearing two really important points. The first is that we can look abroad or we can look back, and we've been through worse. And hopefully it won't take as long as it took to make the 15th Amendment real, right? And I think there's reason to think that it won't. But the second point is that, and this speaks to the question earlier, what can be done in the short term? My view is that institutions need to stick up for themselves, and they need to stick up for one another, particularly the institutions that don't have the military or the police. And there is a sense in which such behavior can be characterized as political, but it's political in the best sense of the word, in the sense of statesmanship that you, Bill, invoked earlier, as opposed to partisanship. I think institutions survive on acceptance. And those who lead institutions, if they know what they're doing, they understand that, and they understand that they need to take some account of the conditions of their own public legitimacy. And I think that's what we've seen, for example, in response, the judicial response to some of the executive orders. I think they're actually quite legally vulnerable because of all the smoking gun evidence of impermissible intent. But putting that aside, one could plausibly argue that the law emerging is somewhat to the left of what the law was before these episodes. And I think there is an irony there that's worth keeping in mind, which is that when the president attacks courts as political, he encourages them to find strength in numbers, to establish cross-ideological alliances, and to behave somewhat more politically than they otherwise would. And from the standpoint of the health and maintenance of the constitutional system, I'm prepared to say, and that's a good thing.
So I think that has been the most interesting, and Linda Greenhouse, who I think is here, hi Linda, wrote a really fascinating column about this in a certain other newspaper that will go unnamed. But I think
failing New York Times.
Yes, that one. Hashtag. But I think that the media, for all of our vulnerabilities and for all of our failures, has a kind of built-in institutional capacity to defend itself. I do worry about, we're going to have to end on this note, we have just a few minutes left. I do actually worry about the capacity of the courts to defend themselves, because they can only do it in this sort of elliptical and somewhat uncomfortable way, right? Do you want the courts making bad law or questionable law because they all need to kind of join forces and respond to an external political threat, or what? The courts have a hard time. Justice Ginsburg, I thought, erred in stepping outside her role. Justice Gorsuch could summon the word disheartening, right, about the president's commentary. The courts have a very hard time defending themselves directly, right, against interference with norms and abandonment of norms. You might have written this also, Dahlia. I wrote like this ridiculous, heartfelt, and totally destined to fail plea to the Chief Justice, right, to argue for, we have a vacancy on the court, let's confirm the justice, or at least have hearings on the nominee, no matter when it comes in the cycle, because we've got the president for 4 years. Ha, ha, ha. That wasn't going to happen. He was not going to step out of his role and say that. So how do courts, other than obliquely, defend themselves, or can they, or how can others step in against inevitable attacks that are to come? Pretty quickly on everybody's part.
During the court packing episode of 1937, Chief Justice Hughes wrote a letter, right, to the Senate, point by point rebutting the president's assertions that the court was behind in its work and needed more help, and explained why, in fact, it would compromise the efficiency and effective functioning of the court if they were packed with an additional 6 justices. So I don't think it's inevitable or ineluctable. Justices do give addresses. They do testify before Congress. They do have opportunities to speak out if they will take them. I think there is a risk, because it'll be attacked as political by the party that doesn't like what they have to hear. But we do have examples from American history of justices taking on a leadership role outside their judicial capacity, inside their judicial capacity, and writing opinions. I think there's a special power in cross-ideological alliances, right? I mean, we know there's at least one justice the president likes and has put his imprimatur on. Is that justice prepared to defer, right, to whatever this president does if it shows up before him in a case properly before the court? And we shall see. But I think not just having liberal justices reject the president's authority, but having the court reject the president's authority if in fact it's unlawful. I think that can be an effective way of speaking out and pushing back.
I mean, it seems we have, like, people up here know more than I do, it seems we have a Chief Justice who thinks as a, let's say, Chief Justice, not simply as a one among many who, I mean, he seems to care about the institutional authority and responsibility of the court, and I assume he'll assign opinions accordingly. I mean, if Gorsuch, I'll just say, I don't no idea what's going to happen. I don't know if the executive order actually gets to the Supreme Court as a live matter, but I would think if Gorsuch thinks that it wants to strike it down, even if only in part, I would think the Chief Justice might assign him the opinion or take it himself and make sure Gorsuch wrote, I think, was able to write in concurrence or something to make sure that it doesn't look like, Ruth, one justice flaked out and joined Ruth Bader Ginsburg or something in attacking Donald Trump. So I do think, I mean, if I were privately advising the Chief Justice, but I'm sure he thinks about this. And this, again, is what somewhat reassures me. You do have traditions here and people, honestly, individuals who were molded in a way educated in a way that I think should give one some comfort that they're not just going to roll, including Gorsuch, incidentally, that they're going to just roll over for a demagogic president.
And can I say one corny thing?
We need to, very quickly, then we need to stop.
Okay, so it's quick and corny. Having been the deranged Jeremiah, I think that what Bill said about sort of the culture of celebrity is really important as a counterpoint to the courts. I think that what we can do for the courts is watch these amazing oral arguments as they happen, which people are doing in unprecedented numbers, and sort of watch the civility and the dignity and the gravitas, and really, as a model of what is not Kardashian, really recognize that is going to sort of light a form of discourse and thinking and fact-finding that we should defend just by watching.
Great. Go forth and watch and listen to oral arguments. Thank you so much. It was a great panel.